Imagine that creative project you'd like to work on. Sure, it's still just an idea, but you've probably got a pretty good feeling for what you want it to look like, especially when it comes to the colors and the materials that will really bring your project to life. Now, there's no surer way to snap you out of this daydream than to have you spend even just a few seconds trying to navigate the maze of material settings in Blender. And a simple search here on YouTube can quickly turn into a nightmare. You get hundreds of videos to choose from, many of them don't agree with each other, and most of them lead you right back into the jungle you're trying to escape. But here's the good news, there's definitely a better way. In fact, it's a much simpler approach to adding realistic materials to your Blender models that I'm about to share with you. Ready? Let's dive in. In our rendering course on our website, we take a different approach to teaching professionals how to get realistic materials in Blender. Instead of focusing on everything Blender can do, we focus on the 10% of the tools and features that will give you the majority of the results you're looking for. And it's that 10% that we're going to cover in this video. Ready? So over on your computer, you'll need to have Blender open, and you'll need a 3D model, whether it's one you've created or imported, or just the default cube here, or another basic mesh. Now to keep this example simple, I'll go with a sphere. So I'll press X on my keyboard, and then click Delete to get rid of the cube. Then hold down Shift and press the letter A, and pick a mesh, and we'll go with UV sphere. Then right click on it, and pick the option for Shade Smooth so that the surface will look nicer later. Now, right out of the gate, you don't need to bother with these material properties over here on the right. Instead, up at the top, go ahead and click on the Shading tab. Up in the top viewport here, we're looking at the materials preview, so it's just a different look at what we're seeing with the sphere. And down in the bottom here is where we're going to have our shader nodes. Now, don't worry if your user interface is a little confusing or you don't know what nodes are. We're going to get into what all of that means in just a moment. But first, let's take a step back. And there's an art and a science when it comes to applying materials to your models. And in general, you'll usually want to apply more than one material to a single model so that you can get different types of colors and textures across an entire model. But for this example, we're going to keep it really simple and add one material to one object, and that will help us uncover how to create realistic materials. So looking back over here, you'll click once on the object, whatever your 3D model is, to make sure that it's selected up top. And then down in the bottom, you're going to click on the New button, and that will assign a new material to that object. Okay, so now up top you see what the material looks like, and it doesn't really look like anything has changed. And then down low, you may have to roll your mouse wheel in or out to zoom in or away from what you see down here. And then hold down your center mouse wheel like a button if you need to pan your view around. And you'll see that you have what are known as shader nodes that are going to help you adjust the look of the material you see up here on your object. Okay, so what are the 10% of the features that you need to know to get a majority of the results you need here? And by the way, these are the same 10% that will actually make it easier to learn the other 90% down the road. Well, to cover that, we need to get into 5 key concepts you need to know. And that starts with, number 1, shader nodes are like a visual representation of a recipe. So each rectangle down here is called a node. I can click once on this green one here, or once on this dark maroon purplish one here, and these are both called nodes. Now, different nodes do different things, but you can think of them as either representing an ingredient or an action in a recipe. And then there's a line here that connects the two nodes. It's known as a noodle in Blender, but it's essentially showing a sequence of steps in a recipe. So here we have a node, and then there's a step in the recipe that connects it to this node. Remember again that nodes are either like actions or ingredients in that recipe. And in your case, when you're working with these shader nodes, you're just creating little recipes that make realistic materials. And that leads us to our next key concept. Number 2, a shader node is like your final dish. Often people will talk about shader nodes to discuss everything that we're doing down here in the nodes area in Blender. But actually, there are many different flavors of nodes. And shader nodes are just one type. So a shader node is green, and you can see that we have a shader node here already. It's called the Principled BSDF shader node. And for all intents and purposes, it is your final material. And keeping with our recipe metaphor, it helps to think of it as the final dish you might get from a recipe. Now, as a quick aside, hold down Shift and press the letter A. And if you go to where it says shader, you'll notice that there are many different types of shader nodes. And the Principled BSDF is just one of them. It turns out, though, it's the only one in the shader node category that you need to worry about at this point. and it'll probably be used for a majority of your material needs going forward. So you can go ahead and hit the escape key here to get out of that menu. Okay, so while this principled BSDF is the final dish or the final material with all of its settings, we haven't set up any steps in our recipe yet, so it's really just a placeholder. We have a bunch of parameters down here that are like flavors in your final dish, but rather than adjusting how salty or sweet something is, here we're going to be adjusting things like how dull or reflective a surface is. Now, before we get lost in this whole mess of settings here, it's really important that we move on to our next key concept, which is number 3, focus on just a few fundamental flavors. So just like chefs have just a few key things like salt, acid, fat that really help bring out the flavors of their dish, you also can focus on just a few of these parameters to get a majority of the results. So looking back at the principled BSDF shader, those are the base color here, which is the underlying color or pattern that you'll see, the metallic setting, which is just for whether your material is a metal or not, the roughness setting, which controls how reflective or dull a surface is. More rough is more dull, and less rough is a smooth and reflective surface. The normal setting here, which can fake 3-dimensional surface variations, and then the transmission setting down here, which helps light pass through materials like glass and liquid. And here's a key thing to note. You can adjust some of these parameters right here in the final dish. So for example, you could click and hold down and drag to the right on the metallic slider, and you'll notice that your sphere becomes quite metallic, or you can click and drag it back all the way to the left, and it's not metallic at all. So in this way, you can adjust any of these elements, and it'll be an even adjustment across an entire surface. But materials are often more varied in the real world, which means that we have more to do here in Blender to create these realistic materials. And that leads us to our next key concept. Number 4, the main ingredients are texture nodes. So if shader nodes here are like a final dish, then texture nodes are the ingredients. Hold down the Shift key and press the letter A, and you'll notice you have a whole category of nodes called texture nodes. The 2 that you'll use the most, and the 2 that we'll cover here, are the noise texture and image texture. For this example, let's add a noise texture. So go ahead and click on noise texture. You'll notice that you have a node attached to your cursor, and over on the left, you can go ahead and click to set it down. If you don't like where you set the node, you can always click and hold down on it and drag it around into another spot, and then let go. Now currently this noise texture is just an ingredient sitting all by itself. It hasn't been added to the final dish. So to do that, come over to where it says FAC, that's short for factor, and there's a socket next to it that's gray. Click and hold down from the socket and drag a noodle across all the way to the socket for base color and let go. And you've essentially created a step in the recipe that says that this ingredient over here will drive what you see for the base color. And you'll notice up here, let's zoom in and pan our view to the top sphere so we get a lot closer. You'll see that it's a black and white texture. And you can come down here and change some of the settings here on the noise texture and see how they change up here on the sphere. For example, with the scale, you can click and hold down and drag to the left, and the scale number will go down, which will actually make the scale bigger here. Or you could click and drag to the right, and the scale value will go up, which means all of the details will get smaller here, or you'll see more and more of the image across this surface. Now be sure to remember what this looked like because we're going to come back to it in just a moment. Now let's go ahead and disable this for a moment. Click and hold down on the socket for base color and drag the noodle away and let go. And you'll notice that you've disconnected that step there. Now, in order to make the next thing work well, let's go ahead and click and hold down and drag to the right on the metallic slider all the way to 1. Now the whole sphere is 100% metal. And let's slide this roughness slider a little bit to the left to make it more or less reflective. I'm going to go with a little more reflective by going to the left. Now try this. Click and hold on the factor socket and let's drag it across to the roughness socket and let go. And you'll see now that this noise texture is driving the roughness. So whereas just a moment ago we saw the whole sphere was pretty shiny and reflective, Now, if you orbit around up here, you'll notice there are parts of the sphere that appear to be more reflective and parts that appear to be quite cloudy or not very reflective. So if we remember back to what that looked like when we had the black and white noise texture on our sphere, every pixel now has a slightly different roughness value. So wherever it was white is 100% rough, which means we don't have very much reflection. Wherever we had black in that original image is 0%, meaning that it would be perfectly reflective. And any shades of gray would represent values in between depending on how light or dark they are. So you would have some that are a little more reflective and some that are a little more dull. So it's by using these texture nodes that we can drive that real world surface variation that we would see by connecting those ingredients directly to the flavors here in this final dish or this principled BSDF. Now, this noise texture is mathematically generated. So we see parameters down here that will change what the texture looks like. So you can try dragging some of them around and you see that it will change the actual look of the texture, whether you're driving the roughness slider or any of the other parameters here. These are known as procedural textures, and if you hold down Shift and press the letter A, under the texture nodes, there are many other procedural textures in this list. So we've experimented with the noise texture, and just with what you've done so far, you'd be able to do the same with some of these other textures. The wave texture, the Voronoi texture, the checker texture, the brick texture, these are all procedural textures that you could drop in here and experiment with, and they would have different values that allowed you to change how they looked. Now, I mentioned the other texture you're going to use a lot is an image texture, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. At this point, it might be a good idea to experiment with some of these procedural textures, kind of see what you can get so far with what you've learned. But then that will lead us right up to this next tip, which is number 5. Most other nodes are like actions that prep, mix, or cook your ingredients. So my morning coffee might call for coffee beans, but there's a step I need to do before I can brew the coffee, and that's that I need to grind those beans. So similarly here, you might start with an ingredient that's either a noise texture or some other type of texture node, but often you need to do something to it before you can hook it up to that final shader node parameter so that it does exactly what you want it to do. So in the case of this noise texture here, we might want to do something to it before it gets over to the roughness or to any of these other primary flavors here of the principled BSDF. And so we would need a step that came in between these two. And it turns out that pretty much every other node besides texture nodes are going to help you make the types of alterations you need. So let's talk about what those nodes are. Hold down Shift and press the letter A. So there are 4 big categories of nodes that will help us make the type of alterations we need. The input nodes, those will usually come before a node, so they'll give some input that will alter things. I'll hold down Shift and press the letter A again. We'll cover those in a moment. The color and converter nodes, those are both going to be really useful in between here because they're going to do something to alter or convert the colors or other elements of whatever is in the texture node before it gets to the principled BSDF. Then I'll hold Shift A to bring that menu up again. And then the vector nodes are going to be another one that helps add something to convert whatever we're working with into something that the principled BSDF can use. And even though I just covered 4 big categories of nodes and there were many subnodes in those lists, we can boil this down to about 3 nodes that you're going to use most of the time, and we'll focus on those now. Now, these 3 nodes that we're about to learn about will also drive not only a majority of the results when you're new, but they'll also make it easier for you to learn some of the other nodes later down the road. So let's take our noise texture and let's reconnect this noodle by clicking and dragging away from the roughness. Let's drag it back up to the base color and let go. And then let's turn the metallic back down to 0 for a moment. So click and drag this slider all the way to the left. For the roughness, let's click and drag it back up towards the middle so that we don't have too much shininess that might distract us. Now, what if we wanted the black areas of this texture to be much darker and the white areas to be much brighter? So we wanted more contrast here. We would need to add a node that would help us make that alteration. And we'd want to add it along this noodle or in between here so that we're altering this ingredient on its way to the final dish so that whatever alteration we make here is ultimately driving what we see in the base color. So let's hold down Shift and press the letter A. And we could probably adjust this using a number of different color or converter nodes. But let's just use one of the most popular. So under Converter, come up to where it says Color Ramp and go ahead and click on Color Ramp. You'll have that node attached to your cursor. Notice that your screen might pan around depending on where you are. So I'm going to hover down a little bit so that this kind of comes back up. And then hover over the noodle itself and click to set this down. If you drop it on the noodle, it will reconnect the steps of your recipe. So you notice that the factor socket is connected to this factor socket, and then the color socket over here is connected to the base color. Now, we can slide the sliders here to experiment with what this does. So over here, I see a black slider, and over here, I see a white one. If you click just above the square here where the arrow is, click and drag to the right, you'll notice that you are dragging the blacks to the right such that areas here that were grayscale, and therefore those were representative of what was kind of gray here. If you slide this over, it's essentially saying all of these that used to be along a grayscale, this will all be black, and now the transition from gray to white will only be these values over here. So the first 50% of values are now black. Notice you could do the same in the opposite direction. So click and hold down above the white square and drag it to the left, and now the white areas become a lot brighter. If you drag them really close together, you essentially get just black and just white with very little variations of gray in between. Now you can play around with this. You can drag one a little further to the left or the right, one a little further to the right or the left, but I'm going to drag it so that the blacks make up about 2/3 here, and then the white I'll drag over towards the black some. So what I want to see is just a few specks of white and mostly black, something like this. And what I'm thinking of here is if this is going to be a metal sphere, and I want it to be that it's mostly shiny, but there's just a few smudges from where people's fingerprints were on it. So over here then, the white areas are going to be where there are smudges. Remember, the white areas are 100% rough when we connect this to the roughness. So that's where you'll get not very much reflectivity. And then the black areas will be 0% rough, which means that they'll be quite reflective. Okay, so let's see how this looks. Let's turn the metal back to 100%. So we're clicking and dragging the metal over. We won't see the difference here because of where this is connected. And then let's click and drag from the base color socket over to the roughness socket and let go. And while it might be hard to see, if you look in a little bit, and as I move and orbit around, you'll see it's quite reflective, but then there's these smudges, is what I'm going to call them, or these little areas where the roughness makes it basically 0% reflective. So these could feel like little nicks or scratches, or they could feel like little smudges left by people handling it. And of course, you could come back and continue to make adjustments if you felt like you needed to see more of the smudges. You could slide these sliders around and try to get that to work for you. Now, all of the other converter and color nodes will generally work like this, where you can drop them in between a texture node and the final shader node, and then that will adjust or alter that ingredient before it gets over to that final dish. So you can definitely experiment with some of those nodes. But there are two other key categories of nodes that I want to cover next. To do that, once again, let's reconnect the roughness, so click and hold down on that socket and drag it up to the base color socket, just so that we can see this more clearly here. And there are going to be times where you're going to need to rotate or reposition a material. And this is a step that should come before the texture node. And to do it, it turns out that you need to add two nodes. So hold down Shift and press the letter A. And we know that if it's coming before the texture node, we should look over at Input. And in the Input, go to where it says Texture Coordinate. Click on Texture Coordinate, and then come just to the left. Notice that it'll pan over a bit. And you actually want to leave some space next to the noise texture, so come a little further over to the left and click to set it down. Now, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of what this particular input node does, just know that it'll help Blender position the texture on your surface. But then it needs one more node to work, so hold down Shift and press the letter A. And this time go to the Vector category, and then come over and find Mapping, and click on Mapping. And then let's click to set the mapping node down in between the texture coordinate node and the noise texture node. Now, vector nodes in general are all about the direction of your materials. And in this case, this node is where you're going to do all of the repositioning of things. So like I said, without getting into the nitty-gritty of everything about the texture coordinate node, just click on the socket next to generated and drag it over to vector. And then on the mapping node, click on the socket next to vector and connect it to the socket for vector on the noise texture node. Then you can use the mapping node to make adjustments. So for example, if you click and drag to the right or left on the X value, you're going to rotate it along only the X direction. Or you can click, hold down, and drag down all three of these. And if you already knew you needed to rotate this 90 degrees, type 90 and press enter, and it will rotate everything relative to one another. So I know this is a little hard to understand why this works the way it does, but for right now, it's just one of those node combos that you want to memorize so that you have the ability to reposition things. And while it's a little bit weird to do it here with the noise texture, just know that if you had something like metal slats that you needed to rotate 90 degrees, you would use this node combination to get that done. Are you struggling to learn how to create renderings with Blender?
Hi guys, I'm Alex, lead instructor at Blender Academy.
The place where professionals go when they're serious about learning Blender.
Blender is a beast of a program to learn, but with the right approach, it doesn't have to be. That's why we created Blender Academy, to help people build the Blender skills they need and then go out and get the jobs they want. We hope you find these lessons to be a good investment of your time. If you do, and you're serious about learning Blender, head over to our website and continue learning with us. Thanks for watching, make sure to like and subscribe, and now, back to the lesson.
Now there is a second node type that I promised that we would cover, and that's another type of vector node that helps you fake three-dimensional details. So let's come over to our node setup. If you hold down the center mouse wheel, you can move and pan down a little bit. We're actually going to add a node just beneath here. So go ahead and hold down Shift and press the letter A. And we're going to cover another vector node type. So remember I said that vector nodes are like directions for your materials? And where we talked about it being a direction in terms of turning things in the last example, there's also three-dimensional directions like pointing out away from the surface. And to do that, we can either use a bump map or a normal map. Now we're going to drive this using a texture node. So if your texture is grayscale, like variations of black and white and gray, then you're going to go with bump. And we'll talk in a little bit about when you would use normal. So for right now, let's go ahead and choose bump. Go ahead and click on bump. And like a recipe isn't always only one series of steps, like often you have steps that are separate from one another, the bump node is going to drive a different flavor in the final dish. So we're going to place it on its own down low here. So go ahead and click and set it down. So it's not in this sequence of events. Instead, it's going to drive the flavor that we call normal here. This is where we get our fake three-dimensional details. So you're going to go ahead and click on the socket for normal in the bump node, and you're going to drag a noodle over to the socket for normal in the shader node. Now, nothing happens because this is an action node, but it needs to act on an ingredient, which we haven't added yet. So let's go back over, hold down Shift, press the letter A, and when it comes to ingredients, we're talking about texture nodes. And let's just go right back to that noise texture. Go ahead and click. And we'll add a noise texture just to the left of the bump node. So go ahead and click to set it down. And then click on the socket next to factor and drag it to the socket for height. Now I'll zoom out a bit and I'll pan over. Now back over on the principled BSDF, remember that we had switched the color to be the base color, but we originally wanted this to be the roughness. So let's click and hold down on the socket for base color and drag that back over to roughness and let go. Then hold down the center mouse wheel and pan your view up, and then roll your mouse wheel to zoom in on the bump. And now you just need to adjust the strength. So you can click and drag on the strength, and if you drag it way over to the left, it becomes far more reasonable. So often these bump nodes, when they're at full strength, they just really trash the material. But you might want some subtle variation, so you just drag that strength over to the left. And then just like before, you can come over to your noise texture here, and you can adjust the scale, and you'll notice you're adjusting the scale of that underlying fake three-dimensionality. Now again, because we have this roughness in here, it may be hard to tell, so I'll zoom out one more time, pan the view up, remember hold down the center mouse wheel to pan it up, and we can just disconnect this roughness altogether. And then if you zoom back forward on the bump area and hold your center mouse wheel to pan your view up, You can increase the strength a bit so you can really see what's going on here. And you can work with that scale again, and you'll notice that this is the fake three-dimensional detail. To some degree, it almost looks like we have like a crumpled foil if we make that scale really small. And of course, we can adjust that strength so it's more subtle, so it's just kind of some little bumps in the surface, or we can make it really strong so that it's quite prominent. Now, with just these basic principles that you've learned so far, you know enough to go out and experiment on your own, and also enough to go look up recipes, just like a home cook would. You have all of the key skills that you need to follow along with different recipes that you find online for how to connect different nodes together, what kind of converter nodes to add in, and you could generally end up with some pretty realistic materials. But just like it would be in the kitchen, experimenting or following other recipes can be really time consuming. And so that's where I wanted to leave you with this one bonus tip. And that's to save time and get the best results with pre-made materials. Now, I talked earlier about how there were two primary types of texture nodes we'd want to learn. The first was the noise texture, which was really just a placeholder for the broad category of procedural textures. And those are those ones that are driven by mathematical parameters. Like if we look back over here and I adjust the scale here of the noise texture, that's mathematically changing what we see. The other type of texture we want to learn is image textures. And those textures aren't driven by math. Instead, it's a static image of something like, say, wood or tile that you would put onto the surface in your model, and then what you see is what you get. Now, fortunately, we don't have to set these things up from scratch or create them on our own. We can actually go out and look for realistic materials that are available to us on other websites. Now, there are all different types of websites out there with realistic materials that you can download and use in your Blender projects. And I'm going to link to several of them in the description for this video. But let's take a look at one specific example, and that's ambientcg.com. So if you go to ambientcg.com, you're going to find many realistic materials that you can download, and we'll talk about how these will be the basis for your image texture nodes in Blender. But looking over at AmbientCG, you could click on Materials, and then you see several spheres that have materials applied to them, and if you scroll down the list, you'll see what these materials would look like if they were applied to a sphere like this. Now, of course, you don't necessarily apply things only to spheres. These could be applied to your ground, to your trees, to whatever it is that you have in your model. But going back over here, I'm just going to look for something, and I'm going to pick one of these very first options here. So I'll click on it, and mine says Paving Stones 142. So if you want to use the exact same example that I'm using here, you could search for Paving Stones 142, and you would find this exact one. And then there are all sorts of reasons for what resolution you would want to download here, 1K all the way to 8K, and then whether you'd want to download JPEG versus PNG. But for this example, we're going to keep the resolution at 2K, and we're going to pick the JPEG version. So go ahead and click on that, and you'll download a zip file. From there, you want to go to your Downloads folder, and you want to unzip that file that you just downloaded. And if you go into that folder, you'll notice that you have several different JPEGs. So you don't end up with only one picture of the brick or the paving stones in this case. Instead, you end up with several different JPEG files that when taken together are going to create the recipe for this realistic material in Blender. So back over in Blender, there's a trick to making this all work. You need to enable a special add-on called Node Wrangler. So let's look at how to do this. Up in your top left menu, click on Edit and go to Preferences. On the left-hand side, pick Add-ons, and then in this list here, you'll find Node Wrangler. I already have it checked on here, but you want to make sure to have it checked on. And then go ahead and close the window. Now down in the Shader Nodes area, let's get rid of everything we've set up so far to have a clean slate. So I'll zoom back a bit, hold down the center mouse wheel to pan down. We want to keep the principled BSDF shader and the material output shader. To get rid of the rest, click, hold down, and drag a selection window around all of those nodes and let go. And then press X to delete them all away. Now select the principled BSDF shader node. And then here's the magic of Node Wrangler. Hold down Shift, Control, and the letter T, and you'll open up a window. Let's navigate to the Downloads folder, into that Paving Stones folder, or whatever the material was that you downloaded. And then it's asking us which of these JPEGs do we need to bring in for the recipe that is going to be these paving stones. Now, while I could select everything here, we're only going to go with the stuff that we've covered so far in this tutorial. So color, that's for base color, we'll select it. I mentioned earlier between bump and normal that we would use normal when we actually had an image for it. And in this case, we do. There are two options that say normal. We see normal GL and we see normal DX. In Blender, you always want to use normal GL. At this point, it's not worth getting into the details as to why, but pick normal GL. So hold down the Command key or the Alt key as you click on it to add it to your selection set. And then with that key still held down, click on roughness. And in this case, there's no metallic properties to these paving stones and there's no transmission properties, so we don't have a JPEG for either of those things. So with these three JPEGs selected, go ahead and click in the bottom right on the blue button for Principled Texture Setup. Go ahead and click on it. And boom, Node Wrangler connects all of them up automatically. Now there is a funky thing going on here for me. If I zoom into my Principled BSDF shader, that's that final dish, because I didn't have a texture driving that metallic value, it's still set at 1 from the previous example, so I'll go ahead and slide that slider down to 0. And then if I hold down the mouse wheel and pan over a bit, these are the texture nodes. So we added a texture node here for base color, we referenced the actual image for that base color, and then this noodle here connected it through to the base color here. If I hold down the center mouse wheel to pan up, the same is true for the roughness. So this is another texture node. We could have held down Shift, pressed the letter A, went to texture, and then brought in an image texture node. And then I'll hit escape. We could have manually associated it with that file and connected it up. But the Node Wrangler add-on did this for us. So what we see here is a little cheat sheet for how this all works. So these three image texture nodes were brought in. Each of them referenced a different JPEG. And then these noodles were connected up to control these flavors for the final dish that is the shader node or is that final material. And so what you end up with here is not only a quick, fast way to bring in realistic materials, but you also have a cheat sheet here for how all this stuff works. So you can dig in here and dissect and learn from seeing how this stuff is connected up. And also, you know everything you need to know to maybe zoom in, for example, to this mapping node over here and change something about the scale or rotation. Okay, so we've only just scratched the surface of all the things you might want to know to create realistic materials in Blender. And that's not to mention all of the camera settings, the lighting, the different render settings that'll go into creating the types of realistic renderings you're looking for. And that's why we decided to release our first unit of our rendering course for free here on YouTube. It walks you through the fundamentals you need to know to be able to render your very first project. I've added a link to the playlist in the description. And if you're serious about mastering Blender and learning everything you need to know to create the types of stunning realistic renderings you need, then I recommend checking out our full rendering course as it dives even deeper into lighting, camera settings, and way more to know about shader nodes. The full course is available along with all our other courses in our video course library. Head over to blenderacademy.com and try our courses for free. I've added links to everything in the description. So what type of realistic materials are you going to create? And what types of projects do you want to render? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, happy blending!